Okay, so today I'm going to cover 5 risks that a system administrator can actually implement into their systems. So obviously not a good thing. So the first risk that I like to cover is the risk that is involved when an administrator doesn't change from the default passwords. So a lot of services within a system will have default passwords that you use to get in and make changes. Um, so yeah, this can be really bad because then hackers can gain access to these default passwords potentially just through a Google search, and then there they go. They have access to whatever service or whatever part of your system that is using this default password. Um, there are some examples of exploits related to this vulnerability. One example would be Katan. An attacker used null default passwords in Microsoft SQL servers, and they used that exploit to launch an attack. And there are also publicly covered breaches related to this vulnerability. Uh, Even here, I've seen this vulnerability be used on um, highway signs. So those have default passwords, and people are able to figure out those default passwords. They never change, and use those and actually change the message on the highway sign. Uh, so yeah, but luckily it's not very difficult to mitigate this risk. You just have to change the default password to a custom one. And then, so the next thing that I would like to cover would be disabled firewall. There's lots of reasons a system administrator might disable the firewall. Maybe they're doing some kind of network connectivity test or uh, changing something within their system. But this can allow data to be stolen or malware installed because you're missing that layer of protection whenever you're opening your computer up to the internet. Um, but obviously, what I'm specifically talking about is when they let the firewall down and then forget to put it back up. And I haven't been able to find any specific exploits or breaches, but I'm sure there are lots of breaches and exploits that involve this, but it's just not like the biggest part of them. Yeah, so basically just make sure you turn your firewalls back on. That's a bit it for that. And then the next part would be excessive permissions. So as a system administrator, maybe it's a small company and you're thinking, oh, I don't need to kind of like keep this guy just to what he needs. I can give him a little more, it doesn't really matter. But later down the line, you might find that if your system gets more complicated and things become more serious, you might regret that decision, and then a user who shouldn't have access to things that they do then uses that maliciously. And then I did find an exploit related to that. It's the privilege escalation attack. Um, and I looked into that a little bit, but so yeah, so this is mitigated by a very common thing discussed in a lot of cybersecurity classes, which is the principle of least privilege, which basically just means that if user A only needs this amount of privilege to perform the tasks they need to perform, that is the most amount they'll be given. No more. Only the amount they need to perform their tasks. Uh, Next would be insufficient logging and monitoring. In your system, you are able to log and monitor all kinds of things, all kinds of important data that's coming in and showing you what's going on. Uh, and if you aren't keeping up to date and making sure that you're consistently monitoring, and I did forget to switch my screen there, that can cause some issues. You need to be properly monitoring. You'll maybe miss something, it'll go undetected, or maybe you won't be properly prepared to handle an attack when it happens. So once again, as a lot of other things, it's pretty easy to mitigate. Just have regular and in-depth logs of all the ongoings in your system. So finally, the last one that I wanted to talk about was poor patch management. And even when it comes to your smartphone or your laptop, which some would consider to be obviously less important than a system that you're in charge of as a system administrator. But uh, even your phone or your laptop, you have to make sure you're installing the latest updates, make sure you have the latest security updates. there are constantly vulnerabilities being discovered, and if you aren't installing these things, then you won't necessarily have the protections against those vulnerabilities. And then also, if vulnerabilities are being discovered about your system specifically, it's important to come up with and implement a patch as quickly as possible. You're just kind of leaving yourself vulnerable to things that you shouldn't be. And I do have an example of a breach, not one of an exploit, but I have a breach example, which was the Equifax breach. And once again, as I've said many times, it's not that complicated. You just need to have regularly scheduled patches and make sure you're properly testing and working on your whole setup. So yeah, in conclusion, I would say overall, the way to take care of risks like these is just to make sure that you're staying on top of all the necessary tasks and all the proper security standards. Thank you very much.